1 cup of coffee. That's all it took to change both their lives. Clara Dawson had spent 6 years in silence, tolerating the cold commands, the public humiliations, and the unspoken rules of power at Harrison Group. She was just a secretary. He was the billionaire CEO, and everyone knew their places. Until one morning, under the fluorescent lights of a glass office tower, she'd had enough. In front of an entire team, Clara did what no one dared to do. She threw her coffee at Daniel Harrison. But what happened next wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was an offer. Work directly with me. 10 days. No walls, no roles, just truth. What would you do if the very person who broke you suddenly invited you to rebuild something greater? This is not just a story about power or love or rebellion. It's about healing in the most unexpected places and what happens when 2 people drop their armor, even if just for a moment. If this story touches something in you, leave a comment below and let us know what your enough moment looked like. And don't forget to subscribe if you believe in stories that heal more than they hurt. Now, let's begin with a cup of coffee. 6 years of silence, 6 years of biting her tongue. But that morning, Clara Dawson finally said enough with a cup of hot coffee. It wasn't planned. It wasn't like her. But something inside her had cracked. Not loudly, but quietly, like the sound of a porcelain cup breaking in another room. You hear it. You feel it. But you pretend it didn't happen until it's too late to pick up the pieces. It began with a name she had spelled right, pronounced right, triple-checked right yet, still. Daniel Harrison corrected her in front of the board like she was a clueless intern, his voice, sharp as glass, cut through the conference room. It's pronounced Mar-e-nez, not Marnez, Miss Dawson. Silence. 12 pairs of eyes turned to her. He didn't even look up from the screen, didn't notice the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she nodded. She had known the correct pronunciation. His was the one that was off. But correcting him, that wasn't how things worked at Harrison Group. Clara said nothing. She never did. Until 5 minutes later, when the meeting ended, and the room emptied in a rush of polished shoes and tight-lipped nods. She walked back to her desk in the outer office, small, tucked beside the glass wall of Daniel's towering suite, and reached for the one thing that had always given her a moment's comfort. Coffee. Dark roast. 2 creams. No sugar. She had just made it. Her fingers curled around the warm paper cup. She stared at the closed door. His name etched in silver letters. Daniel Harrison, CEO. 6 years. She stood up. It was as if her body knew before her mind did. The cup was still steaming. Her heels tapped softly against the floor as she walked back toward the door, knocked once, and pushed it open without waiting for a reply. Daniel looked up, finally. His blue-gray eyes, sharp and unreadable, met hers with a flicker of annoyance. Is there something else? Miss Dawson. She didn't answer. She stepped forward slowly, and then, in one clean, quiet motion, she lifted the cup and poured the hot coffee straight onto the front of his perfectly pressed white shirt. The dark liquid spread like a blooming ink stain. A single drop splashed on the edge of his desk, the sound loud in the stunned silence. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. Daniel stood, his eyes wide. Clara didn't flinch. The silence stretched between them like an invisible thread, and somewhere in the hallway outside, someone gasped. She didn't say anything. She simply set the empty cup down on his desk with deliberate care, adjusted the cuff of her blouse, and turned to leave. Then his voice. Miss Dawson. She stopped, closed the door. Her hand hovered over the handle. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but she did as he asked. When she turned back to face him, Daniel was removing his suit jacket, slowly, methodically. The coffee had soaked through the fabric, but he didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. He tossed the jacket over the back of a leather chair, revealing the crisp lines of his dress shirt, now stained with coffee down one side. "You've worked here 6 years," he said, his voice calm. "Never once raised your voice, never once missed a deadline. And today, you threw coffee at me." Clara stood her ground. "Yes," she said simply. To her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched. A smile, a smirk. She couldn't tell. He sat down. 10 days, he said. She blinked. What? 10 days? You work directly with me. No buffers, no assistants, no email chains. You sit in this office, at this desk. Everything I do, you see. Every call, every deal, every decision. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. If you survive 10 days, you walk away, with whatever you want. Letter of recommendation, position elsewhere, a clean exit. If not, then we both agree this ends. No drama. Clara stared at him, unsure if this was some twisted punishment or something else entirely. Why, she asked. Because you're the first person in 6 years who's had the nerve to tell me I'm wrong without saying a word. His gaze held hers, steady, unreadable. I want to see what else you've been holding back. The room felt too warm. Her heart thudded beneath her blouse. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely. I'll think about it, she said. You have until tomorrow morning, he replied. 5 a.m. And just like that, the meeting was over. She stepped out of the office, closed the door gently behind her, and stood still for a long moment. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only a hum of disbelief and confusion. What had she just done? What had he just done? The hallway was quiet again. Her desk waited patiently, the screen still glowing with unread emails and spreadsheets. Routine beckoned, but something had shifted, and in her chest, where resignation used to live, something unfamiliar was stirring. Clara Dawson had finally spoken. Now, she had 10 days to decide what that meant. The first thing Clara heard that morning wasn't her alarm. It was the fear knocking inside her chest. It was still dark outside when she slipped out of bed. The old hardwood floors in her apartment creaked under her bare feet, and the cold air stung her skin like a quiet warning. She moved slowly, brushing her hair into a tight bun, buttoning her blouse with fingers that trembled more than she wanted to admit. 5 a.m. He had said it without flinching. And she had agreed. Her hands wrapped tightly around a thermal coffee mug, this one for herself this time. Not him, and she stepped out into the sleeping city. The streets were empty, the sky still a shade of navy that whispered the night wasn't ready to let go. Street lights flickered overhead as she walked briskly from the bus stop to the Harrison Group headquarters, its glass facade glowing like a lighthouse in a sea of quiet gray. By the time she stepped off the elevator onto the 38th floor, it was 4:56. The office was eerily silent, not the usual hush of early mornings, but a deeper kind of quiet like being inside a church before anyone arrives for prayer. Clara's heels echoed faintly as she walked toward the glass-walled conference room. Inside, Daniel was already there, sleeves rolled up, eyes fixed on a wall of monitors glowing with numbers and charts. He didn't turn to greet her. She paused just long enough to draw a breath, then opened the door. "Have a seat," he said. A thick stack of papers sat neatly on the table in front of one chair. As she settled into it, Daniel finally looked at her just a glance, as if confirming she was on time, and then returned to his screen. "That's the investment strategy we're pitching to 3 international partners next week," he said. "I want your thoughts by 11. Clara blinked. All of it. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. 6 years of working under him had taught her what silence meant. She opened the first folder, eyes scanning the spreadsheets, forecasts, legal clauses, risk breakdowns. It was dense, jargon-laden, and deliberately intimidating. She reached for her own coffee and took a long sip. Then she began. The hours passed in a blur. The world outside slowly lit up, but inside that glass room, it still felt like night. Clara marked lines, scribbled notes, reread key sections, and fought the rising doubt in her chest that whispered she didn't belong in this room. At 10:47, she closed the last folder. Her back ached. Her eyes burned, but the work was done. Daniel was still by the screens, speaking softly into a headset. She waited silently, then cleared her throat when he ended the call. He walked over. "Well?" Clara slid a summary page across the table. "I've outlined a few risks in Section 3.2 and some inconsistencies in projected returns for the Brazilian acquisition. But overall, if the Asia-Pacific numbers hold, it's strong." He took the page, eyes flicking over it with practiced speed. He didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't thank her, just moved back to the screens. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the weight of disappointment that pressed against her ribs. As she stood to stretch her legs, something tugged at the edge of her memory. A phrase in one of the documents, buried in legal language, had struck her as off. She opened the file again, flipping back to page 74. There, the wording on a fixed interest clause. It was subtle, but her heart picked up pace. It was a strategic flaw, small, but potentially disastrous. If left uncorrected, it could expose the company to a liability clause triggered by currency fluctuations in emerging markets. Clara hesitated. This was not the kind of thing junior staff questioned, especially not someone who had dumped coffee on the CEO just a day before. But still. She picked up the paper and walked over to Daniel's desk. "There's something here," she said, laying it gently in front of him. "It's in the legal phrasing. It's ambiguous enough to be interpreted against us." "I don't think your legal team caught it." Daniel glanced at the document, then back at her. Their eyes met, and for the first time, his didn't carry the cool sharpness she had grown used to. He looked surprised. Not pleased. Not annoyed, just surprised. Then, slowly, he turned back to the page and read it again. The silence stretched. Clara stood still, every part of her telling her to retreat, to apologize for overstepping. But she didn't. After a long pause, Daniel finally said, without looking up, "Noted." It wasn't a thank you, but it wasn't dismissal either. As she turned to return to her seat, she caught something she hadn't seen in 6 years. He was watching her, not just glancing, not judging. Watching, and in his gaze, for just a flicker of a moment, there was something entirely unfamiliar. Respect. That night, Clara sat on her apartment floor with aching feet and a takeout box in her lap, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion, a question began to rise. What would it mean to be seen by a man like Daniel Harrison? She wasn't supposed to speak, but her words turned the room. Clara Dawson had never stepped foot into Conference Room B as anything more than someone pouring coffee, taking notes, or being told to quietly stand by. But that morning, everything felt different. She walked behind Daniel Harrison, heels tapping softly against polished marble, her mind racing faster than her pulse. He hadn't told her what the meeting was about. Only 10 minutes. Follow me. No agenda. No warning. Just like the man himself. Sharp, unpredictable, relentless. Inside the room, 5 people waited, powerfully dressed, sharp-eyed, with the cool detachment of people who moved money faster than some people moved thoughts. International investors, from the sound of their accents and the subtle way they measured every face, including hers. No one greeted her. Daniel didn't offer an introduction. Clara hovered near the back wall, unsure where to stand, unsure why she was even there. The presentation began with Daniel in his element crisp slides, razor-sharp talking points, and calm authority. He spoke of expansion into California's inland cities, the tech-adjacent logistics corridor, a warehouse in Modesto, a transport hub in Riverside. Numbers floated across the screen like a language Clara had been forced to learn over 6 years of silent service. The room responded with nods, a few raised brows, one murmured objection about community resistance. Then, without looking at her, Daniel spoke. "Clara," he said. She froze. All 5 heads turned. It was the kind of turn that says, "Who is this, and why is she here?" Daniel leaned against the table, arms folded. "Share your perspective on our West Coast approach." Her throat closed. The walls seemed to move closer. She stammered, eyes darting to Daniel's face. Stone. Not reassuring, not expectant, just waiting. Clara took a breath. The kind of breath you take when the ground under your feet feels unsure, but you choose to stand anyway. "I think," she began, "we're overestimating how easily the West will accept us." A pause. She felt the tension immediately, like she'd touched something she shouldn't. These communities, they don't want more outsiders telling them what to do, especially not billion-dollar corporations promising efficiency while quietly displacing local jobs. They want real roots, partnerships, not polished slides. A rustle across the table. Someone shifted. Another investor narrowed his eyes. But Clara pressed on. "Our branding, as it stands, reads transactional, not relational. We might secure short-term contracts, but we'll lose loyalty, trust, and probably face public backlash that'll cost more in time and reputation than anyone here is budgeting for." She swallowed hard. "I believe we need to lead with listening, with people, or this entire rollout may collapse before the first truck hits the road." The room went quiet. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Daniel didn't say a word, but one of the investors, an older man with silver hair and soft French vowels, leaned forward. "That aligns with what we've heard on the ground," he said slowly. "Small-town mayors, regional reps, they've been cautious. Not hostile, but cautious." Daniel turned to him, then turned to Clara, and finally said, calmly but clearly, "She's right." 3 words, but they landed like thunder, not because they were loud, but because they had never, in all her years at Harrison Group, been directed at her. Clara stood still, unsure what to do with the heat rising in her chest. It wasn't pride, exactly. More like disbelief. A kind of ache, like a wound she didn't realize was there, had been acknowledged. The conversation resumed. Now. Clara's name came up again, this time with questions. "What do you think about the local partnerships approach? Would a staggered rollout help build trust?" She answered carefully, not trying to impress. Just being honest. And the strangest thing happened. They listened. When the meeting adjourned, Clara gathered her untouched notepad and walked toward the door. Daniel didn't say anything. He just watched, his arms still folded. There was something new in his gaze, not coldness, not even curiosity, but the start of something she couldn't name. The elevator ride down was empty. She stood in the mirrored walls, staring at her reflection-neat blouse, tired eyes, and hands that still trembled just enough to betray how much that room had taken out of her. She hadn't prepared for that meeting. She hadn't planned her words. But somehow, something in her had risen when called, something that had waited too long to be seen. That night. Clara sat in her tiny kitchen, the glow of the fridge her only light, feet bare against cool tile. Her dinner was leftover soup and a cracker she didn't finish. She replayed the moment again and again, Daniel's voice, level and public. She's right. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know if it would change anything. But deep down, she felt it had already begun. The next morning, Clara would receive an email with a calendar invite one-on-one strategy session. 6:30 a.m., conference room A. Just you and me. She stared at the subject line, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Was this her punishment or her breakthrough? Some truths are spoken, others echo in silence. There was something different in the air that morning. Something brittle, like glass stretched too thin. Clara arrived early, as requested. Not by much, just 10 minutes before 6:30, but enough to see Daniel already at his desk, staring at his phone like it had offended him. She knocked lightly, unsure if he noticed her. Then she heard his voice. Not the clipped, commanding tone he used in boardrooms. This one was colder, detached. Yes, Mother. I told you not to call me during working hours. A pause. Then, sharper. No. I don't care about the fundraiser. I haven't attended in 10 years, and that's not about to change. Another pause. His fingers drummed against the desk, slow and irritated. I'm not pretending. I'm working. Like always. A final silence. Then, tell Charles. I said good luck. Goodbye. He ended the call with a flick of his thumb and exhaled, without noticing she was already standing there. Hands loosely folded, eyes downcast out of habit. When he did look up, his expression was unreadable. Ready to head out, he asked. Clara nodded. No mention of the phone call. No explanation. Just the same, Daniel buttoned up, composed, and emotionally distant as ever. They drove out of the city in one of the company's sedans, sleek, silver, and far too quiet. The trip was meant to be a site visit for a new satellite office being built just north of town. But to Clara, it felt like a drive into someone else's world, far from the glass towers, the power plays, and the carefully scripted meetings. For a long while, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft hiss of tires against highway asphalt. Clara stared out the window at rolling fields and aging barns that reminded her of somewhere else, somewhere she used to be before ambition crowded out her dreams. "Do you always talk to your mother like that?" she asked, surprising even herself. Daniel didn't take his eyes off the road, but his hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "We have history," he said simply. Clara didn't push, but the silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It was thick, personal. She shifted in her seat, tugging her coat tighter across her chest, even though the car wasn't cold. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence. "What did you want to be before you ended up in a corner office typing someone else's emails?" Clara blinked at him. He didn't smirk. He wasn't teasing. He was asking. She looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. "A painter," she said. "Oil, charcoal, whatever I could get my hands on. Really?" She nodded. "I even had a scholarship, art school upstate. But," she trailed off. Daniel waited. "But life happens. My dad passed. My mom got sick. The bills didn't pay themselves, and art supplies don't come cheap. So I got a job, then another, then here I am." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Do you still paint?" Clara smiled softly. "No. Haven't picked up a brush in years." She didn't add, "Because I didn't think anyone cared, because it started to feel silly, because I forgot why I loved it." But Daniel seemed to hear all of that anyway. The car slowed as they turned onto a gravel path leading to a partially built office complex. The skeleton of the structure stood against the overcast sky, bare beams, exposed concrete, and the beginnings of what would one day be more polished glass and steel. As they stepped out, Clara glanced at him. For a second, she saw not the CEO, not the cold man from the phone call, but something else. A boy who had learned too early that feelings came second, that being soft meant being left behind. They spent the next hour walking the site. Daniel spoke with contractors, asked questions Clara didn't understand, and occasionally glanced her way, as if checking whether she was still beside him. And she was, even when he said little. Even when his face gave nothing away, she didn't need him to explain anymore. Sometimes, the way people stayed silent told you more than any words could. On the drive back, the sky grew heavier with low-hanging clouds, but Clara felt lighter. For the first time, she didn't feel small in Daniel's presence. She felt curious. Not about his business, but about him. That evening, Clara stood in front of her closet, brushing dust off a wooden case she hadn't opened in years. Inside were tubes of dried paint, a worn sketchbook, and one brush she hadn't had the heart to throw away. Something had shifted, not just in her, but in him too, and neither of them quite knew what to do with it. She'd always thought he was heartless. That night, she saw his heart bleeding quietly. By Friday evening, Clara's body felt like it belonged to someone else. Her legs ached from standing too long in boardrooms. Her eyes burned from screen light and insufficient sleep. Her mind, once sharp, always quick, now struggled to follow conversations that used to be second nature. She had kept up with Daniel Harrison for 5 days. Barely. It wasn't just the pace he set, it was the relentlessness of it. Every morning began before dawn, every evening ended after midnight. Even meals were taken at his desk, between calls, meetings, and terse instructions that allowed no room for breath. And still he didn't stop. The first article appeared online just before sunset. Clara caught it on her phone while waiting for Daniel outside the private elevator. Inside, Harrison Group high profits. Higher pressure. There was a photo of the building they worked in, gleaming, modern, heartless. And a quote from an unnamed employee. "It's like we're machines. You don't matter unless you break, and even then, you're replaced." Clara read the line twice, and she didn't know whether to defend the man she worked for or agree with the people walking away from him. Daniel didn't mention the article when he stepped into the elevator. He just looked quieter than usual. As the floors passed behind them, Clara studied his reflection in the mirrored walls. His face looked pale under the artificial light. There were dark smudges under his eyes that no amount of wealth could hide, but his posture remained the same, straight, composed, untouchable. Until he said, without turning to her, "I need to make a stop before we call it a night." They drove in silence again, this time through quieter neighborhoods. No towering glass, no steel, just brick buildings with peeling paint and small yards bordered by rusted fences. Daniel parked beside a modest home with a broken porch step and a dim porch light. Clara followed him out, unsure whether she was invited, but unwilling to let him walk into the dark alone. The door opened before they knocked. A woman mid-50s, eyes rimmed red, welcomed Daniel with a nod that said more than words could. Her name was Susan. Her husband, George, had worked at Harrison Group for over 20 years until a fall in the shipping warehouse ended everything. Clara remembered hearing about it months ago, a brief email update, a new hire announcement weeks later. Life had moved on, but apparently not for Daniel. He sat beside George's hospital bed now in their living room. Clara stood quietly in the doorway as Daniel adjusted the blanket covering the man's legs and asked how the physical therapy was going. There was no camera, no notepad, no assistant documenting the visit, just a man checking in on someone who once worked under him. Susan handed him a folder quietly. Medical bills, Clara guessed. Daniel nodded, took the folder without reading it, and set it in his coat pocket. "We'll take care of it," he said simply. No grand gesture, no press release, just a promise. On the ride back, Clara finally found the words. "You do things like this often." Daniel didn't answer. She tried again. "That family? They didn't seem surprised to see you." Still nothing. "Finally," she asked, more gently this time, "why hide it?" His eyes remained fixed on the road. "It's not hiding," he said after a long silence. "It's just not for show. But people think you're—" She hesitated, searching for a word that wouldn't sound cruel. Daniel gave a soft, bitter laugh. "I know what people think, but you're not that man," Clara whispered. "I saw tonight. You care." He turned to glance at her, just for a second, and in that one look, brief and unguarded, she saw something that looked very much like pain. They pulled into the company garage without another word. Daniel shut off the engine, but didn't get out immediately. His hands rested on the steering wheel. Clara waited, unsure if she should speak again, so she asked the one question still lingering. "Why not let people know the good you do?" Daniel exhaled slowly, then shook his head, and said nothing. That night, Clara walked home under a sky swollen with rain, holding her coat tight against the cold. She had once believed that Daniel Harrison was incapable of feeling, but now she wasn't so sure. Perhaps his silence wasn't emptiness, but a weight he'd carried alone for far too long. Office whispers are louder than screams when you're the target. It began like most office gossip does, small, slippery, and half-joking. The kind of whisper passed between two cubicles during lunch. Nothing serious, just a raised eyebrow, a chuckle. You've noticed how often she's in his office by the end of the week. It was no longer a joke. Clara had felt the shift on Tuesday. She walked into the break room, and the conversation stopped mid-sentence. People smiled too quickly. The air held something brittle. She tried to ignore it, told herself she was imagining things. But by Wednesday, it became impossible. The smiles were no longer sweet. They were sour, sharp. And when she passed by two junior managers near the elevator, one of them muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Guess it pays to be close to the boss." It wasn't just the glances, the giggles behind half-closed doors, or the passive-aggressive jokes. It was the way her work, meticulous, tireless, suddenly carried an asterisk. It was the way people treated her like a story instead of a person. She'd worked 6 years at Harrison Group, 6 years of loyalty, late nights, and quiet excellence. And in 6 days, that reputation had begun to erode under the weight of assumptions. Clara kept her head down. She didn't want to make waves. She told herself this would pass. But then came Thursday morning. Daniel's assistant, a kind older woman named Ellen, came to Clara's office with a face as pale as the moon. "They've called an emergency board meeting," she said in a hush. "About you." Clara blinked. "What about me?" Ellen hesitated, her voice soft. "The rumors. The board wants Daniel to clarify the nature of your involvement." Involvement. What an ugly, clinical word. It sounded like a scandal, not a secretary doing her job. Clara's palms went cold, but beneath the shock came something deeper, something closer to humiliation. This was the cost of being seen, not as an assistant, not as background, but as someone standing beside the most powerful man in the company. She had broken a rule she didn't even know existed. Don't get too close to power unless you're already part of it. And now she was paying the price. The boardroom glass walls were as clear as ever. She saw Daniel standing at the head of the table, arms crossed. Several men and women in suits surrounded him, papers in hand, voices raised just enough to carry tension, but not content. She stood by the elevator watching, waiting for something, for him to say it wasn't true, for him to defend her, for him to acknowledge that she had earned her place at his side, not with charm, but with courage, not with favors, but with insight. But he didn't say anything, not that she could hear, not that anyone else could repeat. No public declaration, no quiet reassurance, no look her way through the glass. Just a man, calm and composed, saying exactly what was required and only what was required. That afternoon, Clara returned to her office. The door closed behind her with a final-sounding click. She looked at the desk she had once organized so precisely, the notebooks in neat stacks, the pens she refilled weekly, the framed photo of her late grandmother who used to tell her, "Be proud of how you earn your living," and she couldn't breathe. Her reputation was unraveling, and the only person who could have stopped it had chosen silence. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a small cardboard box. It had been folded flat for years, just in case. Clara began to pack, not out of drama, but out of dignity. Each item her favorite coffee mug, the notebook with paint splatters from her college days, the small wind-up clock her father had given her, felt like a piece of herself. She was placing her story back into a box, unsure of where it would go next. She didn't write a letter of resignation. She didn't send a final email. She just zipped up her coat, picked up the box, and walked through the hallways she had once felt proud to belong to. And there he was, Daniel Harrison, standing behind his glass wall, watching. Their eyes met for only a second. He didn't nod. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't stop her. And that, more than anything, broke her. Outside, the cold wind slapped her cheeks. Clara walked into the streetlights with the kind of silence that comes only after betrayal. Not betrayal by a villain, but by someone you had quietly begun to trust. Behind her, Harrison Group loomed like a monument to control and detachment, but Clara didn't look back, not even once. Because if she did, she wasn't sure she could keep walking. Sometimes, love looks like silence. Other times, it hides in the words unsent. 3 days had passed since Clara walked away from Harrison Group. 3 quiet, aching days. No phone calls, no messages, no explanations. Seattle's late autumn sky hung heavy outside her apartment window. Rain tapped against the glass like a clock she couldn't stop. She hadn't unpacked the box she brought home, her old mug, the clock from her father, the pens. They sat in the corner, like orphans, waiting for a future that had shifted course. She didn't cry, not anymore. The first night had drained those tears. The second night left only silence. And the third, it brought an email. It arrived in the early morning, buried between grocery coupons and subscription updates. Sender anonymous. Source a proton mail. Com. Subject you deserve to know. Clara stared at it for several seconds before clicking. Inside was a short note and a PDF attachment. Ms. Dawson, you don't know me, but I'm a journalist following the internal politics at Harrison Group. You've become the center of something much bigger than you realize. I thought you should see this before it disappears." He tried. In his own way. A friend. Beneath the message was a document titled Draft Letter to Board V6 PDF. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. It wasn't long, barely 2 pages, but it held more honesty than anything she'd ever heard Daniel say aloud. To the members of the board, this is not a formal defense, nor is it an admission. It is simply the truth. Ms. Clara Dawson has been nothing but professional, insightful, and invaluable to this company. Her recent presence by my side was not born of favoritism nor convenience, but of merit. She has challenged me in ways no executive ever dared, and Harrison Group has been better for it. If there are whispers, let them whisper. But understand this, she has earned every seat at every table she's entered. I've built an empire with numbers, but this woman, she reminded me why people matter. If the board chooses to remove me for respecting a mind sharper than most in this room, so be it. But let no one question her integrity. She deserves better than that. D.H. Clara blinked hard. The last lines blurred before her eyes. He had defended her, not in the meeting, not in the boardroom, but in a letter raw and unfiltered that he had never sent. She scrolled down to the bottom. No signature, no date. Just those 2 initials. D.H. It wasn't just a defense, it was a confession, and a quiet kind of love letter, disguised as a business memorandum. Why hadn't he sent it? She wondered that for hours. She walked around her small apartment, the letter still glowing on her laptop screen. Was it pride, shame, fear of complicating things further? Or maybe it was something else. She read it again, slowly this time. Every sentence carried the cadence of someone who wanted to say more, but didn't know how, who had spent years building walls of logic, control, and distance, and didn't yet know how to write in the language of vulnerability. By mid-afternoon, the Seattle sky darkened early. The city lights flickered on like stars being born. Clara sat by the window, fingers curled around a mug of tea. She thought back to the week before the late nights, the shared car rides, the way he had listened when she spoke about art and dreams left behind. She remembered how he had never laughed at her, never once looked down, just listened with that still, intent focus that said more than praise ever could. And now, this letter. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he cared too much and didn't know how to show it without breaking. Clara rested her forehead against the cold window pane. She whispered into the quiet. "You tried, didn't you?" In your own way, outside, a car passed through the wet street, its headlights carving golden lines across the rain-slicked pavement. Clara didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in days, her chest no longer felt like it was closing in. Because now she understood Daniel Harrison's silence wasn't absence. It was armor, and somewhere beneath it, he had written words that no one else might ever see, but that told her everything she needed to know. The next morning, Clara opened her door to find something unexpected on the doormat. A single envelope, no stamp, no address, just her name, written in handwriting she instantly recognized. Inside, a note in Daniel's voice. "If you're not done with me yet, meet me where the coffee started it all." 3 knocks. That's all it took to reopen a door she thought was closed forever. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft shuffling of boxes and the hum of the heater clicking on and off in the background. Clara knelt on the living room floor, sorting through files she hadn't touched in years, some from her time in college, others from her first administrative job before Harrison Group had swallowed 6 years of her life. A part of her thought about moving. Not far. Just somewhere new, somewhere that didn't hold echoes of elevator doors and boardrooms. She folded an old photo of herself with a sketchbook, slipped it into a drawer. Then 3 knocks, firm, not rushed, measured. Clara froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. It wasn't the building manager he always buzzed, and it was too early for deliveries. She stood, heart suddenly racing, and walked to the door. There was no mistaking the silhouette behind the frosted glass. She opened it slowly. There he stood, Daniel Harrison, in a dark wool coat, damp at the shoulders from the drizzle outside. No security, no assistant, no polished corporate armor, just a man, with tired eyes and something unspoken resting in the crease of his brow. Clara didn't say a word. He spoke first. "I'm not here as the CEO. I'm here as a man who knows he was wrong." The words hung in the air like breath on a cold window pane. She stepped aside, wordlessly. Daniel entered, eyes flicking around the small apartment, taking in the lived-in chaos of cardboard boxes, stacked books, and half-packed memories. "I didn't know how to call," he said quietly. "After everything. After I let you walk out that door." Clara crossed her arms, keeping distance between them, not out of anger anymore, but out of something far more fragile, self-preservation. "I saw the letter," she said finally. "The one you never sent?" Daniel looked down, hands in the pockets of his coat. "I wrote it 10 times. He admitted, "Each time, I wanted to say more, but I was afraid it would make things worse. I thought staying silent would protect you." Clara's voice softened. "It didn't," he nodded. Slowly. "I know." There was a pause, the kind that feels heavy because it's full of things neither one of them quite knows how to say. Then Daniel spoke again. "I came here to ask you to come back," he said, "but not as my assistant, not even as a subordinate." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded folder. He placed it on her coffee table like it was something sacred. "A new division," he said. "Strategic partnerships. Cross-sector initiatives. You'd be co-leading it with me." Clara blinked. "Co-leading? You've proven you don't just understand the numbers, you understand people. And he exhaled. "I've built an empire that forgot what people need. You reminded me." Clara walked over to the window. Outside, the rain had eased into a soft mist. City lights glowed through the moisture like distant lanterns. She didn't answer immediately. She didn't owe him a quick yes, or a yes at all. "I don't want to be another headline, Daniel," she said, "or another shadow under your spotlight." "You won't be," he replied, steady. "This isn't a favor. It's a partnership." She turned toward him. Her gaze was clear. "Then, let's be clear. I'll come back, but only if we work with each other. Not around, not behind." Daniel's lips curved into something rare. A real smile. Not the one for shareholders, not the practiced one for press conferences. This one reached his eyes. I wouldn't have it any other way. The weight between them shifted. Not gone, but no longer unbearable. Daniel looked around the room again, then back at her. "You're still packing. I was thinking about it," Clara replied. "But maybe I'll wait." He nodded once. "Good." He moved toward the door, hand on the knob, then paused. "You said something to me once that I don't know how to feel. I think you're right, but I want to learn." Clara didn't move, but her voice, when it came, was softer. "I'm not asking you to change overnight, Daniel. Just don't stop trying." As he stepped out into the hallway, Daniel turned back once more. There was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I'll see you Monday. Partner. Clara closed the door gently behind him. The room felt different now, like the first page of a story being rewritten, and somewhere deep inside, she felt it, not just the beginning of a new role, but maybe the beginning of something far more unexpected. He built walls to keep people out, but she knocked without force, and he let her in. The glass doors of Harrison Group slid open like they always had, but this time, Clara didn't step through them as someone waiting to be told where to go. She walked in side by side with the man who used to stand several floors and several worlds above her. Her ID badge had changed. Her title had changed. But what mattered more than anything was how she felt. She wasn't shrinking to fit anymore. She was expanding to meet the space that finally welcomed her. In the weeks since that knock on her apartment door, things had shifted not overnight, but quietly, like morning light easing into a dark room. Daniel and Clara worked together now, not in hierarchy, in rhythm. They sat side by side in meetings, debated ideas, challenged one another not with fear, but respect. Sometimes their words clashed, but not their intentions. More than once, a department head had paused mid-report, eyes flicking between them, sensing something new, not just structural, but human. There was laughter, too, soft and rare, but real. And for Daniel, that was saying a lot. One afternoon, Clara found herself alone in the shared office space they now used. She was reviewing a regional partnership proposal when Daniel walked in, holding 2 coffee cups, one in each hand. "Still take it black?" he asked. Clara looked up, surprised. "You remember," Daniel smiled. "Some details stay with you, even when they shouldn't." They sat down together, steam rising between them. That day, the work talk didn't last long. Instead, for the first time, Clara asked something she'd long wondered but never dared to voice. "Daniel, did your mother ever see all of this?" She gestured around the modern office, the skyline outside. Daniel grew quiet. Then, with a nod, he replied, "She saw the beginnings of it. She passed when I was 23, right before our first acquisition. She never saw the empire, just the blueprint." Clara let the silence stretch. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. She was a school teacher, taught 2nd grade for 30 years. Her classroom had more light than any boardroom I've ever sat in. There was a pause. Then he added, almost to himself, "That's where we're going this weekend." 2 days later, they drove 3 hours north. No business meetings, no investor calls. Just Daniel behind the wheel of a truck he rarely used, and Clara beside him, watching the trees thin into wide-open fields. They arrived at a small brick schoolhouse, abandoned now, but still standing, weathered and full of stories. Daniel unlocked the rusted gate and led her inside. "This was her room," he said, pointing to a corner where faded sunflowers were still painted on the walls. Clara looked around at the empty desks. The chalkboard still held the ghost of a lesson from years ago. Daniel walked slowly to the teacher's desk and sat down, not like a CEO, but like a son. "She was the only person who ever made my father soften," he said, voice distant. She'd scold him for working through holidays, for missing birthdays, and he'd actually listen. Clara moved closer, listening not just with her ears, but with something deeper. She had this way, Daniel continued, of seeing people beyond their mistakes. She'd look at you and somehow know what part of you was still trying. He looked up at Clara then, and for the past few weeks, I've seen that look again. There it was, a truth too vulnerable to be said plainly. But it didn't need to be, because Clara heard it, felt it, in the weight of his gaze. Daniel wasn't comparing her to his mother. He was connecting the dots between two women who had seen him not the empire, not the armor, him. "She reminded me of you," he said softly. The moment settled around them like dust in sunlight, unrushed, unforced. Clara didn't respond right away. She walked over to the windows, looked out at the overgrown field beyond. Something was growing in her, too. Slowly, quietly. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even attraction, though that was certainly there. It was something more dangerous, more permanent, something she hadn't dared name. They left the schoolhouse just as the sun dipped behind the hills. Daniel locked the gate again, pausing for a long second before turning away. In the car, they drove mostly in silence, each carrying something fragile, not ready to set it down yet. When they reached her apartment, Daniel pulled over, headlights casting soft beams across the sidewalk. "I know what I said about walls," he said. "I built them because I didn't know how not to." Clara looked at him, really looked. And now she asked. His fingers tapped once against the steering wheel. "I'm learning to let someone knock." Clara stepped out of the truck, but didn't close the door immediately. She turned, met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel like an employee, or a guest, or even just a partner. She felt like someone who had been let in, not through force, but through something much harder to earn, trust. And something told her, the next time Daniel showed up at her door, he wouldn't just be holding coffee. He never planned to love. She never thought she'd be loved for who she truly was. The invitation arrived not through email, not in a meeting, but on paper, handwritten, folded once, and left gently on her desk. Just one line. "Will you come with me one last time to the place you left unfinished? Signed D. No date. No time." But Clara knew. She knew the place. And somehow, she knew it was tomorrow. The next morning, she packed a sketchbook, not the new kind with clean pages, but the old one, the one she hadn't opened in 10 years. Daniel picked her up just after dawn. He didn't wear a suit, just jeans, a sweater, and a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen, not like this. They drove for hours past the hills, through winding roads thick with fall leaves, and then there it was, the lake, still and wide, framed by trees now brushed with gold. A dock stretched into the water, weathered but standing, just like her memories. She used to sit there and draw, before life demanded a resume instead of a canvas, before survival became more urgent than self-expression. Clara stepped out of the car. Her breath caught. Daniel didn't say a word. He simply followed, quiet, as she walked toward the dock. They sat at the end of it, feet dangling, the lake mirroring a sky that was slowly burning amber with sunset. For a while, neither of them spoke. Clara flipped open her sketchbook, fingers trembling. She ran her hand over a half-finished drawing of this very lake, frozen in time. "I never thought I'd come back," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd ever leave the office," he said, half a smile tugging at his lips. She looked at him. Yet, here we are. And then, he reached into his coat pocket, not rushed, not dramatic, just careful. He pulled out a small velvet box, deep navy blue, weathered at the edges like it had been carried for some time. Clara's breath caught again. Daniel didn't open the box right away. Instead, he looked at her not as the woman who once worked under him, or challenged him, or even saved him. He looked at her the way a man looks at a home he never thought he'd find. "I used to think emotions were distractions," he began, voice low. "That letting someone in would make me weak." He paused. "But you didn't make me weaker, Clara. You made me human." He opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, a solitaire, set in gold. No fuss, no show, just real. "You didn't just throw coffee at me," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting into something that was almost wonder. "You woke me up. Will you stay and wake me up for the rest of my life?" Tears came quietly, not with drama but with peace. Clara nodded slowly at first, then, "Surely." Her voice broke when she spoke, but it didn't matter. Yes. It wasn't just an answer. It was an arrival, a letting go of every wound that had once told her she wasn't enough, every voice that had said she was just a secretary, every night she'd spent wondering if she'd ever matter for who she really was. Now, someone had seen her, all of her, and chosen her. They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon. No applause, no spotlight. Just a woman and a man who had walked through fire, both their own and each other's, and come out softer, not harder. In the months that followed, Clara and Daniel became something the business world rarely allowed partners in every sense of the word. They co-led the Harrison Group, not just as CEO and co-strategist, but as visionaries who had learned through pain and patience that kindness doesn't cost profit. It creates legacy. The toxic work culture shifted, staff turnover dropped, mental health days were added, and at the center of every big change was one simple question Daniel asked in every board meeting. Is this how we'd want our own families treated? Some didn't believe the change. Others resisted it, but most followed it. Because for once, the leadership wasn't built on fear or ego. It was built on healing. And in Daniel's office, still minimalist, still quiet, sat a glass display case. Inside it, a simple paper cup, the same one Clara had once thrown across the room. The coffee stain had long dried, but the moment had changed everything. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolutions start not with power, but with courage. Not with shouting, but with one woman who dared to say enough. It was late evening. The lights of Harrison Tower shimmered across the skyline. Daniel stepped out onto the balcony, a soft breeze catching his shirt. Clara joined him, her hand sliding easily into his. They looked out not at the empire they had built, but at the world they were still trying to change, side by side, still waking each other up. Sometimes change begins not with a grand plan, but with one small, honest act of courage. Clara Dawson didn't set out to challenge a billionaire or rewrite her future. She simply reached a point where silence was no longer strength. It was self-betrayal. In that one moment, coffee in hand, she chose to reclaim her voice. And what followed wasn't the end, but a new beginning. This story reminds us that it's never too late to speak up, to set boundaries, or to demand respect no matter how long we've stayed quiet. Even in a world that seems too powerful to challenge, one act of honesty can ripple into transformation. And perhaps, like Clara and Daniel, we all carry wounds hidden behind our roles. When we drop the masks and meet each other with truth, we don't just change our relationships, we change ourselves. So if you've been holding your voice back, waiting for the right time, maybe that time is now, because healing doesn't always begin in softness. Sometimes it starts with a spilled cup of coffee. Thank you for spending your precious time with Clara's story. If this journey touched your heart, gave you hope, or simply made you feel a little less alone, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Every click helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life. And if you have a story of your own, we'd love to hear it in the comments. Until next time, take care and keep shining.